Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Professor Richard Conder, and we're going to look at the life and times of Winston Churchill. This episode covers his birth through to the end of World War I. A future episode will take us through to his death in 1965. Richard, good to see you.
Good to see you, Tony. Nice to be back with you.
It's always a pleasure to have you on the show, you know that. Can I start off with an Argentinian anecdote? When we were doing a trip on a boat from Buenos Aires round to Valparaiso in Chile, had to get off at various points and obviously went on excursions, and we got onto this excursion, and as we got onto the bus, we discovered that we were the only two English people, 38 Germans. It was a Fawlty Towers moment. The guide, who announced himself as being half Argentinian and half German, started off by saying, "Who was the greatest man of the 20th century?" Well, Christine sort of muttered, "Winston Churchill." And we sort of reclined in the seat when he made the announcement, "It was Winston Churchill." And it was so embarrassing, you wouldn't believe it really was a Fawlty Towers meeting. Wow. Anyway, he went on praising Mrs. Thatcher, etc., and it was, a very, very good excursion, and the penguins looked quite good.
Brilliant.
What have you got in response?
Well, I think that's a really good introduction, because we're going to spend quite a bit of time over the next couple of meetings, get-togethers, talking about Winston Churchill. I've been thinking about that quite a lot, where he sits in the pantheon of history. And I think, and of course many would disagree, but we all have our own opinions, that it's difficult to gainsay the view that he's probably the greatest historical figure, UK historical figure, for the last 2 millennia, basically since modern history started. Yeah. And if you think about it, I've tried to think about it and think who would stand above him in terms of the broad sweep of his life, which we're going to discuss. And it's very difficult to think. I think there are many great figures. Wellington, Nelson, Elizabeth I, possibly Henry VIII, William the Conqueror. But many of them are either known for not particularly good things, or in the main, one or two major events, major impacts upon the history of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain, or the world. But Churchill encompasses such a broad range of events, and in most cases, a case can be made for him making such a positive contribution. And of course, there are negatives as well. No human being is without those. But if you measure it in the whole of his life, his impact upon history and his impact generally for the good of the progress of mankind, as he would say, I think it's very difficult to find a figure who would match him. And even if you go internationally, you might say Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Franklin Roosevelt, Bismarck, or perhaps in a less, certainly not in a good way, Mao Zedong, Lenin, Stalin. But most of those, certainly from our perception, a Western perception, would be negative. I think it is very difficult to find a figure who matches him. Either matches him historically for his impact or matches him for his positive impact. And it's interesting, behind me there are, as there were last time, a huge pile of books on this related subject. And one of them is Roy Jenkins' biography of Churchill. And the last line in his biography says that, having examined written books about Disraeli and Gladstone and many other historical figures, Jenkins comes to the conclusion that Churchill was the greatest person ever to occupy number 10 Downing Street.
That's so.
And of course, they didn't come from the same political persuasion.
No, of course not. Yeah. Okay, but let's start with the. He was born 1874 at Blenheim Palace into the aristocracy. Yeah. Father English and mother American. Yeah. The royals apparently envy Blenheim. Did you know that?
Well, I didn't, but I'm not surprised, having been there a number of times. It's as near to Versailles, I think, as anything in this country.
Quite incredible. And school days were pretty unhappy, I think.
Yeah, he went, like so many did, he went to boarding school at 7,
Yeah.
to his first boarding school. He was quite a willful child, and not particularly studious. I'd hesitate to say academic, because certainly proved later on he was both intellectual and academic, but not studious. But I think it was mostly about being willful. And he went to a succession of boarding schools, never really marking himself out either academically or in terms of sport, and was in a fair number of scrapes. He did eventually get into Harrow. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who briefly had been Chancellor of the Exchequer under Lord Salisbury in the 1870s. His father had gone to Eton, but he either didn't get into Eton or wasn't put forward. His father had a low regard for his academic abilities. So he ended up at Harrow, which is in itself a good school, but struggled or just didn't apply himself, and was quite willful. There's one famous story at Harrow where he crept up behind a senior boy who was standing by the swimming pool. He was quite young then, and of course he's not how we portray him now. He had quite red hair and freckles. And anyway, so you can imagine this naughty little boy came up behind this senior boy, who happened to be Leo Ambury of More in a Moment, and just pushed him straight into the pool. Which is not. I went to boarding school, as you know, and as a young Irk, one regarded the senior boys as titans. I can't imagine me doing that. But Leo Ambury eventually became a very senior parliamentarian, and obviously got to know Churchill very well.
There was a joke.
Father of Julian Ambury.
Yeah. There was a joke that he was self-educated from the time that he went to Harrow, on the basis that they didn't teach him anything. But
yes, well, that's true. I think he, like a lot of boys, I have been a teacher most of my life. A lot of boys, he was a late developer.
Yeah,
and we'll come to in a minute his time in India. But during his time in India, he decided to educate himself. But perhaps we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But in every way, he was self-educated. He had a very challenging time with his parents, who themselves were estranged for a good part of their marriage until Lord Randolph died in the 1890s. But and I think you can only describe them, as so many aristocratic parents probably were, as quite neglectful. And yet he, on the other hand, idolised his mother and idolatrised his father. And some of the letters you read that he wrote to his mother. Please write to me, darling mummy. I am so unhappy. I haven't heard from you for such a long while. And they didn't reply to him. So he was willful, but I think he was also very an emotional child as well. They probably both went together. And I suspect some of his behavior at school undoubtedly was a consequence of his childhood and his relationship with his parents.
He had siblings, Richard. Were they treated in the same way?
Well, one has to be careful what one says, but his brother, he had his brother Jack, and his mother had, I'll say no more than a reputation.
Right, okay.
Really Churchill.
Yeah.
And let's say there are scurrilous questions about Jack's parentage.
Yeah.
Jack was very, very, very different to Winston. They were very close, and they were. And what I've just said, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. There was just unpleasant rumours. So, but they were very close. But Jack was very different to Winston, and actually died at a very young age, as a lot of the Churchills did. Winston Churchill always thought he would die early, and he thought if he didn't achieve much in his life by the time he was 60, he wouldn't have time. His father died when he was 45, when his father was 45. But so the one brother Jack, who had a military career, they were very, very close, as were Clementine Churchill and Jack's wife, who I think she was known as Googie. Yeah, I think the nickname Googie. And the families were close, but Jack died in the 1940s. And there was quite a big gap between Jack and Winston in terms of age.
Yeah. Who was the eldest?
Winston.
Yeah. So effectively, then Jack went into the army, but Winston went to Sandhurst after he left
Yeah.
He went to university?
No, he didn't. He wasn't successful enough at school
Yeah,
to go to university. His father had gone to Oxford, but Winston didn't. And he actually, there's this story of Winston being on the floor of the nursery, lining up all his many hundreds of soldiers in the exact formations of the Battle of Waterloo. And his father came in and observed him. Winston didn't realize he was there and said, "Would you like to go into the army, my boy?" Because his father despaired of him, and couldn't think of a career, didn't think he was going to make anything of his life. And he made it very evident to Winston that he didn't think Winston would make anything of his life. And he said, "Yes, I would, father, if that's what you would like me to do." Yeah. So I think he scraped into Sandhurst with quite a bit of coaching. But once he got there, I think he flourished. He didn't, I think, pass out in the top echelon where he would have gone into the Guards, and so he went into a horse regiment, which those who weren't right at the top and destined to become generals and field marshals went into a horse regiment. But he flourished as a man and loved being in the army. So yes, he got into Sandhurst after Harrow, and became passed out of Sandhurst as a lieutenant.
And of course, got involved in active service pretty early on, didn't he? Because he ends up in the Sudan in 1898.
Yeah, well, he first of all went to India.
Yeah,
and with the cavalry regiment. Spent quite a lot of time learning to play polo, for example, which is what there wasn't much going on. But he thirsted for action, and he ended up on the northwest frontier in Malakand, in the Swat Valley. So he fought in the Swat Valley in the northwest frontier. Could have been killed. Many people were. And then returned to India and the area around Calcutta. Wrote his first book called the Malakand Campaign or something like that. Yeah. But this is where he started to decide he had lots of spare time, that he would educate himself. So he asked his mother to send it out as many of the very, very learned, like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, those sort of things. And he absorbed them like a sponge. He realized he was uneducated. And something happened to him around his late teens, early 20s, when he had a thirst for knowledge. So he spent a lot of the time in India learning, educating himself. I should have said before he went to India, he went to Cuba and got involved in the Cuban Rebellion. I think it's true that he was in 4 different continents and was in 4 different wars in 4 different continents: Cuba, India, the Indian subcontinent, Sudan, as you said, and then ultimately South Africa. So, and he wanted to put himself into where the action was. So you mentioned the Sudan, Omdurman, and he pulled a lot of strings, or his mother did, for him to be transferred from India to Sudan. Lord Kitchener, who was in charge of the campaign against the Mahdi, was very, very angry that he had this upstart, this publicity seeker, as he would regard him, foisted upon him. But he was in that campaign and is known to have been in the last ever cavalry charge by a British cavalry regiment, and was under fire and was under attack, and did have to defend himself and shoot people. I think his compassion is more evident because often there's this belief that Churchill was a warmonger, and in politics, these terms get thrown around. But he wasn't compassionate. He wrote another book or a report on the Sudan campaign, which included a heavy criticism of Kitchener's treatment of wounded wounded rebel soldiers. I don't know what happened. One assumes they were just killed. And he was very critical of the treatment of the native soldiers by the British, by Kitchener, as he had been in the past about the treatment of the Indians, Indians in India by the British Army. So this idea, Churchill is a man of his time.
Yeah.
I've recently read an article by Max Hastings that said, Max Hastings is a biographer of Churchill. By all means, criticise the attitudes and the behaviours of people in the past, of historical figures, but do not try to judge them by the values that we have today, because you have to look at them.
As it was then.
Yeah. So he would certainly have views that might today be regarded as unacceptable. But he also had a very deep compassion for people, both in the UK and, as I say, in the battles and the campaigns he was in, who were different from him and less fortunate than him.
So after the Sudan, he becomes a war correspondent for the Second Boer War, and he actually ends up being imprisoned at Pretoria.
Yeah, in Pretoria. Yeah, he was on a troop train, and the Boers had blown up the railway tracks, so the train was stranded in the middle of the desert, and they ambushed it, which was obviously their intention. And he led although he wasn't actually a soldier at that stage, he was a war correspondent. He led the attack against them, but they were all captured. And then, of course, famously, he escaped from captivity and made his own way completely independently back to the British lines, which included a spell being hidden by some friendly South Africans at the bottom of a coal mine. And he spent a week hiding from the South African, the Boer troops and those who were searching for him, because he had the classic poster, Winston Churchill, £500 reward, alive or dead. So the classic one, and they were searching for him. So he was hidden, as I said, for about a week, but anyway, he was hidden for a period of time at the bottom of a coal mine. And eventually he got himself back to British lines. He did briefly rejoin the army for a brief while. Can't really tell why, but he did. So, but that was for a brief while. And then he got himself back to the UK. And of course, being Winston Churchill and a man of letters, he wrote up the story of his escape and his imprisonment, which no doubt was in heroic terms, and became a national hero, which was a pretty good stepping off point to stand as a Conservative MP in October 1900. Yeah,
for Oldham.
For Oldham, yeah. He was unsuccessful in the first instance, but he did eventually get elected to Oldham. They seem to have different ways of creating vacancies then for people they wanted in the House. Yeah. So after one unsuccessful attempt, he fairly quickly got elected to Oldham as the Conservative MP in October 1900.
So he's in Parliament, he's in the House of Commons. He obviously doesn't quite like the way the Conservative Party is working at that time, and he crosses the floor. So he rats.
Yes, he fell out with the Tories, mostly over free trade. He believed in free trade, and they had a campaign of protectionism at that time, tariffs and so on. We've heard about those recently with our friend over in the United States. But so he was a free trader. And he fell out with them. And he was also, I've mentioned his liberalism with a small L. He was campaigning for things like old age pensions, minimum wage, those sort of things. He was a pioneer in those areas, and improved conditions for people like miners. Funny, the miners always regard him with some antipathy, but because he was the pioneer in trying to improve conditions for them. So he fell out with them and crossed the House and was welcomed by the then Prime Minister, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, and became a member of the Liberal Party, and was fairly quickly started to take on roles as a very young MP and junior ministers in the Colonial Office and elsewhere, and in trade. So he was on a pretty fast trajectory within the Liberal Party at that time.
I've got a heading here based on the Andrew Roberts book of liberal imperialism. How would you define that?
Well, I think it's his view of imperialism, Churchill's view, and Andrew Roberts was a very paternalistic approach to imperialism. And clearly imperialism now is an anathema and unacceptable colonialism. But the Liberals at that time, it was about improving the lot of the colonies which Great Britain had taken unto itself. Now, now, as I said, one judge is difficult to apply today's values, but Andrew Roberts, and there is a case to be made for this, would make the case that British imperialism was one of the most benevolent of all. It was not very different to the French or the Spanish or the Portuguese, or indeed the German. So it included building hospitals, creating education, advancing agrarian reform, bringing much more land under cultivation, a traditional civil service, parliamentary democracy. On many occasions, of course, excluding the natives, but they did lay those foundations, and a rudimentary healthcare, and getting rid of some of the more barbaric practices, which and the superstitions which were blighting the lives of natives. Now, that is paternalistic. That's white people going into colonies and telling them how they should live their lives. But that was liberal imperialism. And basically, the liberal part of it was that the motherland would take the goods, buy the goods from the colonies, of course, much to the benefit of the motherland, but in effect would create trading opportunities for them to the exclusion of other markets. So it basically created I hesitate to say it, a common market of the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
But I'm not making apologies for it, because now it is unacceptable, and some practices by the British towards the natives were utterly abhorrent. And the treatment of them on an individual basis on occasions were abhorrent. But that was what liberal imperialism was deemed to be, rather than the conservative approach, which was tariffs to keep out foreign goods like cotton, like wheat, like coffee. Well, not coffee because you couldn't make it in the UK, but those sorts of things to protect the home industries. Liberal imperialism, it used what's called in economics the theory of comparative advantage, that if our colonies can produce cotton more cheaply than we can in Lancashire, well, Lancashire can do something else, and everybody benefits, because we can do things, technological things, that the colonies couldn't necessarily do. So that was what liberal imperialism was about, and of course was the big dividing issue, like the EU has been for the current generation, because you had free trade conservatives and protectionist conservatives, and on the liberal side you had a similar pattern. I mean, on the conservative side, Joseph Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain's cousin, I think, I may have got that wrong, he fell out over the issues of trade and free trade and protection. That was the big issue at the turn of the century.
Can I make a point though about the British Empire, and that is, if we hadn't have taken those countries, somebody else would have done, wouldn't they?
Almost certainly, because it could well have been Germany in the first two. And I mean, the French, I've been reading quite a bit about French history. The French were building an empire of their own. And they weren't prepared to give it up. I mean, the Algerian War in 1958 was an example of the French refusing to do what the British do, which was to release develop their empire and their colonies, to allow them to become free governing. So, I mean, yes, you're right. Others would have taken it over. Churchill was passionate about the empire, but he was passionate about it for some of the reasons I mentioned, that he believed that it was a source for good, and for mankind. That's how he would justify it. He would get a very difficult time now, and because times are different, and understandably, but that was his belief. And you're quite right. I mean, European nations, Belgium as well, were grabbing colonies left, right, and centre during the 19th century. And if it hadn't been Britain, it would have been someone else. And I think there can be a case made for probably the British Empire being the most benevolent, but that's not to say there weren't some pretty dreadful things done.
Oh, of course.
But most benevolent compared to others,
Now, Mrs. LeBlanc insisted that I mentioned that in 1908 he marries Clementine, who
Yeah.
in many respects was, you know, a wonderful lady in terms of support that she gave him all the way through their married life, which went through to 1965, didn't it?
Yes, Clementosia. She wasn't sure to start with because you know, he was still a bit rackety and a bit always getting himself into political scrapes. So he had to ask her a few times.
Yeah.
Interestingly, he did propose to one or two other individuals, but it was never serious. He knew Clementine was a woman for him.
Yeah.
And I've got a theory, and it's, I have no reason to be able to put much meat on the theory, but great leaders very often are in very stable marriages.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, compared to some of our current crop of world leaders, and you compare how they treat the people who are close to them,
Yeah.
says a lot about the way they conduct their politics. Now, Clementine was a wonderful support to Churchill, and Churchill loved her to the point of idolatry almost. I mean, they had a classic aristocratic marriage. They spent significant amounts of time apart, but there was never ever any question about Churchill's fidelity to Clementine. That's what I meant about how great leaders, you can get some, I can't put any measure on it, but I think if you look at successful great leaders, one, they have a stable domestic life, and two, they are loyal and supportive of the people. Now, I mentioned this. I'm not saying Nixon was a great leader, but a lot of his strength came from the strength of his marriage, and the mutual love and respect each had for the other. So yeah, I agree with Mrs. LeBlanc. It was a very, very important part of his success. And actually, Clementine she was a very bright and intelligent woman. Certainly she was liberal and always was liberal. So she would have been an influence on him in terms, particularly when he moved back to the Conservative Party after his 2 decades as a liberal, in terms of his social policy and his view of social issues. So she would, and he shared a lot with her. So yeah, very, very important part of his life, very important part of his political life, and the rock against whom he leant in difficult times.
So he crosses the floor in 1905, and by 1910, he's the Home Secretary.
And the youngest Home Secretary, the youngest Home Secretary, I think, almost in history. And one of the 4 most senior posts in the British government. A great supporter of David Lloyd George, and David Lloyd George, who was Chancellor. They were very close. There's a number of books behind my shoulder, 2 of them, one called Churchill and Lloyd George, and one called David and Winston, about that relationship. And Lloyd George was driving through an awful lot of social change, and Churchill was a great supporter of his. They worked closely in tandem. Probably his best known event when he was Home Secretary was the Sydney Street siege in January 1911, because he could never stay out of the action, and the anarchists he got there, and there's famous photographs of him standing there alongside armed police. He got heavily criticised for it because, you know, he claimed he just went there to observe, but it's difficult to imagine him not getting involved. But it wasn't really the Home Secretary's role, but he couldn't stay out of the action. Yeah. Again, going back to the views of him as that some attention-seeking historians might say these days, you know, that he was much of the right and very conservative. And interestingly, of the 43 death sentences that were passed during his tenure as Home Secretary, I think he commuted 21. Which is a very high rate. Yeah. And he improved conditions in prison, removed all sorts of corporal punishment, removed isolation in cells. So he did a lot of humanitarian work in terms of the ways that the prison regime was managed. So again, a lot of evidence there that some views about him in terms of his approach to liberal issues need perhaps to be re-examined.
1914, First World War starts, and he gets a lot of criticism in terms of 1915 and the Dardanelles.
Yeah. Well, I'll just go back a bit. One of the great things he did was that the Spithead Review, just off the Isle of Wight, where the whole of the fleet came together to be reviewed by the King, was in August, and he refused to allow the fleet to disperse after the Spithead Review. Mm-hmm. It might have been in July, I can't remember, but it was around the start. So he was very prescient, because when war was declared, the fleet was together, and he could immediately deploy it into blockading Germany, and which of course is always the key part of the British attempt to manage its opponents and enemies on the continent, is to blockade them with its navy. So the fleet was ready, largely thanks to Churchill. He worked very closely with the First Sea Lord, Jackie Fisher, Admiral Jackie Fisher. They fell out big time ultimately over the Dardanelles, but he worked very closely with them. So yeah, we came to the Dardanelles. Churchill, throughout his leadership, was really looking for soft ways to bring the end to conflict, rather than face-to-face across the trenches confrontation. And at the time, Russia, which was an ally, was facing enormous German pressure in the Caucasus. And Churchill's view was that if you could take Turkey out of the war, or bring put Turkey under enormous pressure, Germany would have to take the pressure off the Russians in the Caucasus to support its ally, Turkey. So he had this plan for the fleet to go through the Dardanelles, the Dardanelles Straits, which are a narrow channel which gives access to the Black Sea. And it has to be remembered, it was his idea, it was his plan. But the cabinet, which was Asquith's cabinet, of which he was a member then, fully endorsed it. So the fleet and the army went there. Unfortunately, on the very first day when the fleet attempted to take the Dardanelles, go through the Dardanelles to get into the Black Sea, they lost 6 ships. And I think both Jackie Fisher, particularly Jackie Fisher, Admiral Fisher, Churchill himself to an extent, and certainly the admirals on there panicked, or became understandably very worried, and pulled the fleet out. So that, if they'd have got the fleet into the Black Sea, they would have bombarded Constantinople, Istanbul now, because they would have had battleships with 15-inch guns, and Turkey might well have sued for peace under those circumstances, because with the whole of the Black Sea to maneuver in, the fleet could have been protected, but they would have basically had the capital of Turkey under their guns and under control. But it didn't happen. The real mistake was then not to just abandon it, because then they decided to attack the Gallipoli Peninsula, the Gallipoli Isthmus. And if one sees Gallipoli, I've not been there, but I've seen it obviously in films. Basically, you've got these heights which rear up from the sea. So they were landing, and I'm very unfortunate, it was the Australian troops, who were mostly Australian, and the Anzac troops and the New Zealand troops, were trapped on these very narrow beaches. And what they had in front of them was these heights, rear up. They're not just cliffs, they're almost like mountains, but they're certainly very steep hills. And the Turks were on top of them with full view of both the navy and the troops on the beaches. And it was a disaster. And again, it was it's like so much in the First World War, it was persevered with far too long.
Yeah.
Far too many, and ultimately they pulled out. A bit like an early example of Dunkirk, they pulled out at night. They did manage to get all the troops off, just about all the troops, those who, and they had all sorts of ingenious devices in the trenches to make the Turks think the trenches were still had got troops in them. Like automatic firing rifles, that sort of thing. But it was, and Churchill, somebody had to be found as a scapegoat. He was the architect of the Dardanelles campaign, and so ultimately, well, he was redeployed from the Admiralty to, I think, to the Board of Trade, which was very much a demotion. And Clementine said she thought he would die of depression. He thought his career was finished; he would never recover. And of course, the Tories, who held a visceral hatred for Churchill at that time because he left their party and then campaigned against them, would have nothing to do with him, and really used the Dardanelles as an opportunity to undermine Asquith's government. And when Lloyd George went into coalition with the Tories, with Bonar Law, Andrew Bonar Law being the Tory leader, their condition, the Tories' condition for supporting the coalition was that Churchill couldn't be in the government. So they got their revenge, and Churchill, in extraordinary, again, we haven't said about his depressions and his black moods, which were very much a part of his personality. Initially went into depression, and then quite extraordinarily decided he was going to go and fight on the Western Front. And in early 1915, he got himself a lieutenant colonelship, I think, to lead a battalion on the Western Front at a place called Plugstreet, which is called Plug Street.
Yeah.
And so he led this battalion. He was much loved by the troops under his command. Initially, of course, there was hostility to him. They thought, who's this man who's just failed in the Dardanelles? But he won them over with his bravery. He went out into no man's land on many occasions, and led them in battle, and also worked very hard to make the conditions of his troops more bearable in the trenches. So he was much loved by his battalion. But of course, interesting, Toe, when one thinks of the slaughter on the Western Front, one stray shell, and that's history changed.
Yeah.
There was an occasion when a huge piece of shrapnel landed within feet of him. And of course, there were many lucky escapes for many people like that. But eventually he asked to be relieved of his command. He remained a member of Parliament, because I think Lloyd George wanted him back in the government. And he came back and had various posts in the government, which included Minister for Munitions. One of the great scandals of the First World War was the shell shortage. And David Lloyd George, as Prime Minister, said he was going to address this, and he brought Winston Churchill back to deal with the shell shortage and the problems with munitions. Also, of course, Churchill was also the father of the tank.
Yes, I was going to mention that.
Somebody said about Churchill, didn't they, that he had 100 ideas every day and 5 of them were brilliant, and you had to find the 5. And one of them was the tank. And so he came back and held various posts right the way through the war and beyond the end of the war, which included, as I say, Minister of War, Minister of Munitions, and various other posts. Lloyd George remained very close to him and loyal to him. So, and then, of course, in 1917, the Russian Revolution occurred. And Andrew Roberts, his biography you mentioned earlier, said one of the things about that Churchill, one of his great qualities, was his strategic insight and vision and anticipation. He recognized the threat of Prussia in the turn of the 19th, 20th century, and that Germany would ultimately try to develop hegemony over Europe. Churchill recognized that early on. That's why he wanted the Navy built up. He immediately recognized the issue with with Lenin and communism and what it would mean for Eastern Europe and Russia. So he opposed communism passionately from day one, and indeed initially tried to encourage the French and the British Army to support what were called the White Russians, who were opposed to Lenin. but he pretty quickly saw the futility of that. But yes, that was another Churchill initiative, which wasn't a great, by no means was a success, and probably would have been better never to have started it. And then, of course, going forward, and we'll come to this next time we talk, his anticipation of the threat of Nazi Germany was also. So Andrew Roberts says he recognised, before nearly everybody else did, the threats that these military powers or these political movements had to the stability of the world. So that again showed remarkable prescience.
Well, Richard, it's been very, very interesting. I think, we've done a reasonable sketch of a very wonderful man's first, however many years it was. And we're going to have another chat about it, aren't we? Possibly in March as we do part 2. But meantime, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
So did I. Thank you very much, Tony. Great to talk and great to see you as always. Thank you.